Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar sponsored by SDC and Styrus Research on how to prevent, identify, and implement a successful clinical trial rescue. My name is Melanie Ciotti. I am our marketing strategist here at SDC, and I'll be your moderator for today's presentation. Before I introduce our speakers and the agenda, I want to review some basic housekeeping tips about our webinar software. First and foremost, today's webinar is being recorded live. We will send out an email within about 24 hours of today's presentation with a link to watch and share the recording at your leisure. There are two audio options for listening in on today's webinar. If you are experiencing any audio issues, I recommend changing from your computer speakers to dialing in via phone or vice versa. If you are still having trouble after this switch, please let us know in the chat box of your webinar control panel. Either I or my colleague Louie, who's logged in the back end, will respond with additional recommendations. In order to minimize audio feedback, all audience members are muted by default. However, we do encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. Please use the chat box in your webinar control panel to submit your questions to the speakers. At the end of the presentation, we'll go back and answer any questions as time permits. If your question pertains to a specific slide, please indicate that in your question so we know where to go back to. Slides are numbered up in the green box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. It is my pleasure to introduce Lynn Canton, our first speaker for today's presentation. Lynn is a project manager at Styrus Research, an entrepreneurial CRO with a long history of rescuing clinical trials. She has been in clinical research for over 20 years. She started off as a nurse and then became very interested in the science side of things as she specialized in microbiology. She became a lab assistant, then her career spread through many functions in clinical operations, including study coordinator, CRA, study and project manager, clinical manager, director of clinical research, and several consulting roles. She specializes in oncology, neurology, and dermatology therapeutic areas. Lynn is a registered nurse with a degree in microbiology and an MBA in pharmaceutical management. She is joining us from Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and we are excited to share her experience and best practices as an expert in clinical operations and rescue studies. Terry Hicks joined SDC in January 2014 as Director of Data Management. She has over 20 years of industry experience as well, focused in clinical and health information and specializing in data management services for clinical trials. Prior to her position at SDC, she worked for medical device and material science company W.L. Gore & Associates. She also held career positions at Wolters Kluwer Health, Watson Pharmaceuticals, and Quintiles. Terry is experienced in all phases and stages of a clinical study, from feasibility through archiving. She maintains an array of therapeutic area expertise, including those listed on the screen, just to name a few. She has implemented and overseen several clinical trial rescues in her tenured career in clinical research and data management, which she will share with you throughout today's presentation. For today's agenda, our speakers will begin by discussing how to prevent a clinical trial rescue, or in other words, how do you do it right the first time? Next, they will identify some warning signs that might indicate that your study is becoming at risk or is on the road to needing a rescue. Lynn and Terry will then share their best practices for implementing a successful transition plan using real-world case studies to explain these tips in action. Finally, they'll sum up with some key takeaways that you can bring back to your organizations and implement in your ongoing and upcoming clinical trials. After this core presentation, we'll conclude with about 15 minutes left for Q&A from the audience. Please remember to submit your questions through the chat box in your webinar portal, and we'll get to as many as we can within the hour. Thank you again for joining us for today's webinar. I'll now hand things over to Lynn to start us off with preventing a clinical trial rescue.
Thank you so much, Melanie. Good day, everyone. Preventing a rescue really begins with getting off to a good start. You obviously want to set yourself and your study up for success. And it starts with a careful due diligence during the RFP process. Do you know what you need from your CRO to make your study a success? Do you know what to look for. Do you need to increase your internal staffing expertise by bringing on board experts with experience in the field? Do you know if the CRO that you're looking for has the bandwidth to execute your vision for this study? And looking at their experience, as they conducted similar studies, not only in the same therapeutic field and same stage, with the same level of complexity, but also do they still have this team available to you to be assigned to your study? And do they have experience with the sites that you're planning to work with in this project? Including a operational manager during this process and during the qualification process will help you not only target exactly the questions that you want to have an answer for, but also fully assess the CRO capability. And it will help you also to transition from BD to operation when the CRO is selected. Talking about the transition, when the selection process is completed and your CRO has been selected, you should make sure that the transition from BD to operation is formally and not just a lax handoff. You want to make sure that the vision and the expectations that you have defined during the RFP process and during the whole selection process is actually transferred into the operational team. Then when you start working with the operational team, you should go back to what you had defined as critical factors. You know, what were your expectations in terms of your team members' experience, and see if the team that was assigned to you is still aligned with your expectations. When you start working with them, ask yourself, is it working well? The sooner you assess problems, the better you'll be to actually be able to address this problem and prevent further and more important issues. Then, obviously it's also about, representation. Is your team representing you well? Are they responsive to you? And obviously building trust is important and something that we should do from both sides, from the CRO and from the sponsor side. And to do that, I guess we should encourage our internal team to, and as well as our external team, to ask questions. We should open communication channels and listen to challenges that people think that we could have, or maybe issues that they have identified. Ensure that everyone has a chance to voice their concern. And finally, at the end, you should do what you say and say what you do. That will help people to trust you and also will help to achieve your goal and expectations. Then, the vision that you have defined during the startup process will be carefully implemented if you have a chance to involve people from the get-go and also communicate to them what you had defined initially and make sure that it's fully understood with the operational team. So you get started properly and you're off to a good start.
Here are some additional tips to help you get off to a good start. Avoid the assumption of knowledge. So what do we mean by this? It's important to go into the study and relationship without assumed knowledge. Try to assess and identify the level of expertise that each role brings to the table. So how do we do this? We can do this by having well-defined roles and responsibilities. Understand who is on the team and what the roles are. Sometimes we make assumptions on the scope of a role based on our past experience. For example, is the project manager responsible for driving the data management activities? It's important to determine who will be the decision makers and who are the influencers in decisions. For example, who should be included in site activation discussion and decisions? Who should be included in database build discussions and decisions? Identifying this up front will help your project timeline stay on track. Also, identify stakeholders and sharing of clear expectations. By identifying the stakeholders and having the discussions on expectations serves several purposes. It helps level set expectations for the study team, and it helps build trust. This communication can also be done at a kickoff meeting. You can also identify and discuss who will be the reviewers of documents and who will be the signatories. as well as expected timelines, potential risks to those timelines, and maybe what can be done to help mitigate any potential risks. Also, find out what past experience the team members have. Lynn mentioned this in the previous slide. This includes team members both on the CRO and the sponsor side. Do the team members have experience in the study indication or the technology being used, such as the electronic data capture system, the EDC system, or the electronic trial master file, or even the clinical trial management system? If there is experience, ask the team members for their opinions on what went well and what they would recommend they do differently. If there isn't experience, then this gives you an opportunity to put into your timeline that training will need to occur for folks that haven't had the opportunity to work in those systems. Lastly, create mini milestones. These are small identifying milestones that can be kind of kept track of, but if the mini milestones are slipping, it will have an impact to your major milestones. So some mini milestones, for example, could be the reviewing of documents, the approval of documents. While these contribute to things such as a database go live, if these are being missed, it will have a potential negative impact to the major milestone. By identifying and resolving these risks early on, we'll ensure that the project will stay on track. So prevention is the best medicine, but if you can't prevent it, early detection is your best option.
Now we're going to identify some of the warning signs that mean that your study could be at risk of needing a rescue. Here are some examples of what could go wrong. The communication is actually usually the first trigger. If it's slow, poor, or non-existent, if you're being told X and you're given Y, if your primary point of contact is absent, non-existent, inefficient, and you have to call multiple people to get an answer, that might be a problem. That might be a sign that you have a problem with your communication. Also, in terms of proactivity, if your CRA always waits for you to ask for something, or if they are non-proactive or they never make recommendations or solutions, that might be a sign that maybe you do not have either the communication or the expertise that you're looking for. These are some of the questions that you should ask yourself when you evaluate your communication with your CRO. It's usually the first trigger that something is not going right with your study and needs to be addressed. The next warning signs that you may have experienced is the lack of ownership. When nobody seems to take responsibility for action, this actually usually comes from both sides. As a sponsor, you expect your CRO to commit naturally to your study and be an extension of your team. But do you treat your CRO like a vendor? And treating a vendor like a vendor, may not empower your CRO to be a committed partner in the study. Do you feel that there is a us versus them mentality within your team? And really, from an outsider perspective, it should really be hard to know who is from the sponsor and who is from the CRO. Do you feel that the small problems keep spiraling up into big problems and both sides are blaming each other? Then maybe again it's a lack of ownership. The other thing that is I wouldn't say pretty frequent, but frequent enough, is actually the scope creep. When the CRO change orders all the time and not necessarily to add any value, that might be a sign that perhaps your expectations were not properly communicated at the beginning or misunderstood, or maybe the CRO has misjudged what they needed to achieve your project successfully. The CRO not meeting expectations. Well, you were promised an experienced team, but you're constantly having feedback, or you're seeing that the level of expertise or experience is just not there. Is your team creative? Do they have problem-solving skills? Do they communicate to you, when problems arise? And more importantly, if you clearly express your concern and that your CRO is not meeting your expectations, Do they seem to make any efforts to address your concern? That's another warning sign that you should really pay attention to try to correct and go back on track with the communication and with your CRO. Many people think that missing a deadline or a milestone is the primary reason why sponsors bring a rescue CRO on board. However, if you miss a deadline or milestone, it's most likely the end result of a series of warning signs that were missed or that issues that could not be addressed successfully. And so many rescue studies happen even before a milestone is missed. And sometimes rescue CROs are brought on board ahead of milestone is being missed, and that puts the project back on track and the original timeline is met. So timing is the essence into rescue studies. On the other end, if your CRO expects a milestone to be missed or delays maybe with the timelines, and they're capable of, they know the root cause and they communicate to you why and they provide a plan to minimize the risk, then maybe it's worth keeping that CRO on board and see how they're doing for the next step then. So while missing a milestone is usually the most apparent sign, it may not be necessarily the last straw. Finally, when things are going well, from a project perspective, but there are signs that your CRO may going out of business. It happens. It's rare, but it's certainly something that should trigger an urgent action and should trigger maybe a rescue right away while your team is still on board. All those warning signs that I just mentioned to you can usually be categorized under 3 root causes of non-performance. When your team does not know how to do it, they just don't have the expertise. When they don't have the resources to do it, or when they don't want to do it for different reasons. And no matter which of these categories your situation falls under, you should identify the root cause and the reasons behind the non-performance before you move forward with the next step. So you're better equipped to move forward with the next step.
So what are your options? Some folks may not be aware that there are many options to consider when determining the course of corrective action. The first thing to do is to identify the root cause of the problem. Lynn mentioned several warning signs in the previous slide. Can these be remedied? Let's take a look at a few. Are the timelines being pushed out? If so, why? Is there scope creep? Are the stakeholders and signatories being pulled into the conversation too late? All of these can be contributing factors to missing timelines, and these can be identified early on. Is communication poor, non-existent between the CRO and the sponsor? The question is, then, is there a communication escalation plan in place, and has it been activated? We recommend that the communication plan be part of the RFP process, part of the study startup, to create what that escalation plan should be. So when things arise, people know what that plan and what can be expected from a communication resolution process. Another thing that can go wrong is, have there been change orders that have occurred that as a sponsor you were not told about? You just basically received a bill for it. This I would escalate to management very quickly. Really, there should be no surprises on change orders. It should be discussed in the team calls. And if possible, sometimes the effort for those change orders, there should be a ballpark figure on what those change orders will cost. That should not come as a surprise to the sponsor. All of these items that I just mentioned can be remedied and can be escalated in order to find a resolution, but it really does take the team to work together to level set those expectations and come up with a resolution and stick to the commitment of that resolution. Another issue that can occur is really around the data quality or the quality of the work that's being performed. Does the activity that's occurring by your CRO, is it violating any regulations? This is a much more serious issue, and this needs to be brought to the attention of leadership immediately. So once you've assessed the issue, the next thing you can do is assess where you're at with your study. Knowing the status of your study will help determine the level of risk involved in making a change. Is the study just starting up? Is the database built, but maybe enrollment has not yet occurred? In this case, there are more options and less risk. But what if the study is in conduct and all subjects have been enrolled and their data is in the database? Again, more risk is involved because of all of that data and all the activity that has occurred on that study to date. So these need to be assessed, basically prioritized, almost like a pro and con effect of risk analysis. So some of your options is to resolve it with the current CRO that you're working with. And this is the most desirable state if this can occur. So once the risk assessment has been looked at, you'll be able to have a better idea whether your current CRO will be able to make the corrections necessary. So if you do choose to move forward with your current CRO, it's important to create a resolution plan. And this document should be defining what the issues are and what the team has agreed to resolve those issues. But again, if we're talking about a quality or regulatory issue, it may be better to engage with another CRO. So keep in mind that if you are contracted to work with a full-service CRO and you are only having issues with one group, you can just move that portion of the project to another CRO. So for example, if you're having issues with your data management group within one CRO, you can choose to maybe move that activity to another CRO. Your current CRO should be willing to work with you on that because they too want you to have success in your trial. And even though it may change the contract and it may even change slightly the pricing because they may have provided you a bundle cost, it is something worth investigating. So what if you do seek another CRO to help rescue? If you decide to use a new CRO, then the study team, and this includes the sponsor and the new CRO, should create a rescue plan. This will be similar to the study startup activities and in that the timelines will be created and certain documents will need to be redone as to follow the SOPs that will be followed. So now let's talk about how to implement a successful transition plan.
When you decide to move forward with a rescue study, the most important best practice I can share with you is, again, to carefully select your rescue partner. However, this time you're better equipped. You know what went wrong with the previous CRO, and you know the root causes of non-performance. So you should, again, go through the due diligence in your RFP process to make sure that you do or you make the right decision, and that this RFP process includes all the aspects that you have defined critical with the previous CRO. You should be open with your new CRO about the issues that you had experienced before, so they can address and correct those issues. For example, if you were unhappy with your project manager being based in different time zones, you should make sure that your RFP includes that information so your rescue CRO knows that this is an important point to you. If you were not satisfied with the therapeutic experience of the project team, make sure that this is an important section in the RFP document, and that's prominent in this document. Make sure that you ask questions about the specific studies that they have supported in the therapeutic area. If you think that this was a problem, maybe with your previous CRO, maybe if you didn't ask enough questions, maybe you should further drill down into the previous experience, and also if the individuals that are now being considered for your study, if they have more experience compared to the team that was assigned to you previously. And you should tell them specifically what the expectations are, and if they have the bandwidth to actually meet your expectations. Obviously, rescue strategies or rescue studies are usually implemented with compressed timelines, and you need to make sure that they have the bandwidth to execute the rescue in time and to actually meet your milestones and goals. For example, do you need 50 sites initiated in 5 weeks, or do you need 100 sites closed in 7 weeks? Can they do that? And not only can they do, but how are they planning to do it? your team should be proactive and they should work with you and not just for you. So they should come back with a proposed solution or a proposed plan to meet your expectations. And before you select them, you should ask for customized solution and a customized plan that will meet your expectations and your specific needs. If you're having trouble with recruitment, ask them, how they're planning to address that issue. Are they coming up with the usual solution or just increase number of sites? Or are they proactive and creative? And are they coming up with strategies, for example, to repair the relationship with the site? Do they have experience with the site? Have they build relationship with the sites that you have in this study? And can they build on that relationship? There is obviously no one-size-fits-all answer, and the CRO that you're planning to select for the study should show creativity and should provide you with a customized plan based on your situation and whether your problem is retention or execution or something wrong with the database or communication. Every rescue study requires a customized solution. In the next couple of slides, I'll share with you some customized solutions that we implemented in our recent studies at Cyrus. So I'm going to talk to you about two rescue study cases. This first case is about recruitment. This was a phase 2 prostate cancer study, and they're usually a little bit difficult, the cancer study, but that one was, I would say, more challenging than usual in terms of inclusion, exclusion, and also in terms of study procedures. And the original CRO was very behind on site initiation and recruitment. And already there were about a month of delays in the timelines. So the sponsor asked Cyrus to step in and rescue the study. Well, the good news was that we had previous experience with these sites. And our proposed solution was twofold. First, obviously, we needed to scale up the workforce to get all sites initiated as soon as possible. But also, we needed to come up with a creative solution to boost site sense of urgency to enroll patients in that compressed time frame. So we came up with this idea to partner with the Prostate Cancer Foundation. And the sponsor thought that was a good idea and decided to implement our suggestion. They donated $100 for every new subject that was enrolled in the month of December. And that actually worked very well. Not only we were able to enroll all patients by the end of December, as per the initial goal, but also we surpassed our deadline, and I think at the end we actually enrolled 32 subjects total. And the sponsor donated $1,200 to the Prostate Cancer Foundation. And we were able to use that, of course, and sponsor as well as a marketing tool, as a communication tool with our site. At the end, there was a great deal of pride and loyalty built between the sponsor, the rescue CRO, and the site. Not only we had achieved our goal, but also everybody felt that they had done, above and beyond just execution of the trial. And that carried through, not only in the extension study, but all the future trials that we had with that sponsor and the site, needed a rescue. So if we look back at the key success factor and why that rescue strategy was successful, well, I think, there's that creativity factor, the fact that we came up with this suggestion, and that obviously comes with experience, but also because we had already a relationship with the sites and we could build on that relationship to motivate the sites to embrace this initiative that we were proposing. So I think, these two factors, and also we had the possibility to quickly increase the workforce. That's the flexibility also that we have. And all these factors combined made that rescue study successful. And in this second case, we're going to talk about the closeout visits, and again, in the context of condensed time frame. And this was a different study, different sponsor. It was a phase 4 diabetic study in the U.S. and Canada. We had a total of about 134 sites, and it was a stressful period. With just 7 weeks before database lock, the original CRO unfortunately came back to the sponsor and said that they didn't have the resources to complete the monitoring activities and the closeout visits. And initially it was at 49 sites. So Cyrus was brought in to take over those 49 sites. But within 1 week of us getting involved, the original CRO came back to the sponsor again and said that, unfortunately, they couldn't do it for another 50 sites. So, again, monitoring closeout could not be done, but this time was for a total of 99 sites. So we had 99 sites to finish monitoring, and close within a total of 6 weeks. We brought an experienced team of CRAs on board. We were able to re-expand our team. So the initial team that we had on board, we expanded it to add additional individuals that were experienced and ready to get started and deliver quality work. Obviously, because they were experienced, they didn't need much training to get started. And we were able, within 6 weeks, to not only finalize monitoring and make sure that all DCS would be addressed, but also perform the closeout visits and collect all the regulatory documents within that time frame. So this timeline, or this milestone that was super important to the sponsor, which was the database lock, was achieved on time. We were very proud of, this achievement. And if we look back at why we succeeded, why we were able to do it, well, obviously we had the experienced team on board to be able to deliver quickly and, with quality, the work, and to achieve, those different aspects of the study within the timeline. So being nimble was one of the success factors. Being able to scale up another time was the success factor, one of the success factors here. And being able to do it was important. It's not about just doing it, but mobility without quality would have been another disaster. So we had the experienced workforce to achieve it. And also the good quality. We discussed about quality communication being important. I think, being able to communicate our expectations and to communicate efficiently and quickly all the way from the CRAs to the site was important, because obviously many of those different tasks needed to be achieved in sequence and also in parallel. So we needed to make sure that all our activities were aligned and lined up to be able to achieve that database lock in time. Going back to communication, without proper communications, we would have probably missed the database lock, because, obviously we would have some delay in accomplishing the different tasks that require that closeout visits and all these different activities before the database lock.
So let's review some data management best practices for rescuing a study. Again, I want to stress the importance of a consultative approach. As Lynn mentioned, there is no one-size-fits-all answer for rescues, and this applies to data management as well. The rescue CRO you choose should assess the current status of the study and database and make recommendations from there. Some things to consider in assessing risk are: who owns the contract with the EDC system? When people are considering a rescue, this is not always something that they think of in the forefront, but it is important to know this because this can impact the level of risk. So, for example, if the sponsor is the one who owns the EDC contract, then it will be important to find a CRO who is familiar with that particular EDC system to take over the study. I would recommend that the incoming or rescue CRO perform an assessment of the database to determine if there were any gaps in data collection or edit checks. And this is really just to ensure that the quality is up to the sponsor's standards. This can be done by reviewing the database specification documents and performing some additional user acceptance testing, or UAT, just to see how that system is performing. The study will be able to retain all of the database specifications and UAT documents from the original CRO, but the prior CRO's data management plan should be retired, and the new CRO should create a new data management plan, or DMP, describing that transition. So basically, what was the study status? Like how many queries were there, how much data was in there in the database, and then also what is the cutover or the date of ownership for the new CRO data management group. Now, if the current CRO owns the contract that you're trying to maybe rescue that study from, this can be more challenging. One of the things you can ask them, are they willing to have the contract transferred to the sponsor? In some cases, they may not even have the ability to do that, depending on what their contract is with their EDC vendor. If they're not able to transfer that contract over, by transferring it over, you can retain the data in the same database. So that is optimal. But again, like I say, if they're unable to do that, then a data migration may need to occur. And so what does this mean? It kind of sounds like a scary process, and in some cases, depending on how much data is in the database, it can increase the risk. But what you'll need to do in a data migration is that all that data will need to be transferred from the current EDC database into a new database built by the rescue CRO. So this will require the rescue CRO to basically build the database from scratch. And when I say basically, there are the specifications from the previous system, but if it is a different EDC system, the new CRO will have to be able to basically translate what that study design is into the new system. If it is, you're going to be rescuing it from one system to the same system, a different contract, then those specification documents can be very helpful with the new CRO. So when you're building a database from scratch, regardless if it's in the same EDC system or a different EDC system, you still need to create the specification documents for that build, and you will need to fully test that or fully perform user acceptance testing on that build. Also, you'll need to do a data migration or create a data migration or a rescue plan. It can be called one or the other. So what does a migration plan look like? Basically, it's going to be a document that is going to map which variables are moving to which variables in the new system. So it's a mapping process of data being transferred to its new home in the new database. If you are migrating data, you will also have to have your previous CRO send out what we call subject case books with the audit history attached to it. And the sponsor will be the keeper of this information. And why do you need to have what was in the old database that you've retired, in a sense? This will have to be printed out and sent to the sponsor and put in the TMF file, the trial master file. And the reason for this is because when an auditor comes on site and wants to look at data, they need to have that traceability back to the site. How did that data get in there? Well, if you're cutting over from one system to another, there's a break in that traceability. So you have to have a copy of the audit trail in both databases to show that traceability. In addition to having those case books, I would also recommend that the sponsor also receive all of the trial master file that the original CRO has had. So all of the specification documents, all of the training records, all of the data that goes with that EDC system and that data management build should be forwarded to the sponsor as well. So let's talk a little bit about the formal transition plan. Once you have an idea of what you want to do, formalize a rescue or transition plan that outlines the following key items. Risk assessment of data quality. So identify the critical safety variables. So that includes your primary endpoint, your secondary endpoint. A lot of times your statisticians will be involved in defining what these critical variables are. They also include safety variables. So identify those up front. While it's important that all data is transferred accurately, and it absolutely has to all be transferred accurately, I just recommend having more scrutiny put around the critical variables, so additional testing, additional reassurance that all went well in that data migration. Identify each step in the transition process. Make sure you have a clear understanding of the risk to data quality. So data migration, understand how will the data be transferred from one EDC system to another. Will this be done electronically through data transfer files or via data entry? I will tell you in my experience, I've more routinely, when you're transferring from one type of EDC system to another type of EDC system, I have seen a combination of both data being transferred and data being entered, because there's just some components that can't clearly be transferred over into, for example, from a one-page form to a log form or vice versa. Sometimes those transfers can be tricky. And so it's necessary to maybe do some of it via data entry. Again, you'll have to have a plan for that data entry. Is it double data entered? How's it being verified? Is there going to be an audit performed on that? Oh, if so, what's the audit plan for data entry? All of that will have to be worked into, identified, and put into your plan. Also, you'll want to document which documents will the previous CRO provide. So make sure you get all of those necessary documents. We call things basically a document that defines how that form is created, how the what the edit checks are. Were there any changes to that database? What training occurred? The data management plan. There's all sorts of documents. Any documents that they have that normally go into their trial master file, you'll want to receive a copy of that as well. You'll also need to identify in the plan what documents will be updated or possibly recreated by the rescue CRO. And the one that comes to mind immediately, of course, is that DMP that we talked about previously. But there's going to be other documents that will be identified in this area as well. You'll want to identify the training in the new plan. What will you have to retrain your sites if you're using a new EDC system? And if so, you'll have to document how that training will be conducted. You also want to identify whose SOP you'll be following. So now that you're transferring from one CRO to the next, whose SOPs were you following before? Were you following the CRO's SOPs or were you following the sponsor's SOPs? So that's something to be discussed, identified, and documented as well. And then lastly, you'll want to talk about, or not lastly, but you'll probably talk about this more up front, but what is the timelines for the activities? So once you have this plan in place, it's going to be very similar to a new study, which is what are the timelines? When can people expect things to occur? And then manage the project based on those timelines. So now I'm going to talk about a case study that we did here at SDC. So this case study represents two pivotal clinical trials running in parallel by a sponsor who brought this to us. They were actually in two different therapeutic areas, so they weren't related to each other per se, although there was some very common elements between the two projects. The sponsor was dissatisfied with the inactivity of the database build, which was delaying their overall study timeline. One of the studies that we're talking about was crucial to the success of their company, so needless to say, there was a great deal of executive management focus on this trial. So first, SDC took a consultative approach and discussed the sponsor's options. The database build was not complete, so no subject data had been entered. Again, this really helps reduce the amount of risks when you're doing a rescue study. The current CRO owned the EDC contract, so the sponsor was not committed to the EDC contract and could choose to move to another system. So in this case, SDC had the bandwidth and the ability to build their database in a different EDC system and in a faster time frame. When you work with certain EDC systems, you become very proficient in them, and sometimes it's just better to switch to a new EDC system. So a fresh start seemed like a good option for these particular studies. As you can see in the graphic here, each study database released into production took it took 8 weeks, but the second one started 1 week after the first. This was the plan from the get-go. This was our way of being able to use any efficiency that we could and apply it to the second study. We were able to use the efficiency and design of the CRS as well as the edit checks and other database elements. This saved us both time and resources on the project and saved the sponsor money in this case. In total, we built both study databases, including one with IWRS, in a total of 9 weeks for the sponsor. They were able to get enrollment started and patients entered in a timely fashion for both studies. Key success factors for this study were taking that consultative approach. It's just key to do this. I mean, sometimes I think people are thinking, I've got to hurry up and make the switch and we've got to move really fast. And that is absolutely true. However, taking the time during this consultative approach can actually save you time. It's worth talking through the scenarios and the best options. In this case, another key success factor was having that staggered database build approach. By just having a week apart between the 2 studies, we were really able to gain quite a bit of efficiency. And the last, and I will say, another very, very important aspect was the team communication by both the sponsor and the CRO. And when these study builds were going on, there was constant communication. The sponsor had really committed to getting back to questions that the data management team may have had on study design and build, and I would say it was routine that you would get a response within a half an hour. And it wasn't uncommon if people were working a little bit later and on different time zones, there was still a response. There was just a real commitment on all sides to meet these timelines. So on a project like this that is resource intensive and time sensitive, being committed is absolutely key. A one-day delay can easily cause a ripple effect, but a committed team will make sure the project stays under control. I'll wrap up with some of the key takeaways from our presentation. First, prevention is really the best medicine. Do your due diligence in the RFP process and follow up after the contract. Get off to a good start in your project by building trust with your partner, having clear communication channels, and proper roles and responsibilities defined. Set your study up for success. Identification. You should be aware of warning signs early in your study before milestones are missed, and consider your options. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing approach. There is an in-between in the options that you have. Implementation. There is no one-size-fits-all solution for rescue studies. We recommend taking a consultative approach and being creative with customized solutions for each rescue study. From a massive workforce scale-up to a single consultant with a novel idea to do anything in between, the sponsor and the rescue CRO should work together to find creative solutions to get the study back on track. And remember, some of the key success factors we pointed out in our case studies: being nimble, focusing on high-quality communication, innovative solutions, experience on similar studies, a consultative approach, staggered database builds, and team commitment. All of these are just some examples of things that can help a rescue be successful, but there are just so many more depending on the situation. So we want to thank you for joining the webinar, and we hope that you've learned some tangible tools that you can bring back to your teams in implementing your studies.
Great, thank you so much, Terry, and thank you, Lynn, for the presentation. Just a reminder to our audience that we are going to have Q&A at this point, so please go ahead and submit your questions in the GoToWebinar panel if you haven't already. I do see we have several questions that have come in already, so I'll go ahead and start with some of those. Terry, there's a question here about your consultative approach that you mentioned a few times, and they'd like some clarification on when you say consultative approach, do you mean that the sponsor hires you as a consultant to work through the problem first and then hires you for the solution?
Hi, thank you for the question. Yeah, that's a good question. We use that term in our industry a lot, and it can actually mean, like you say, bringing someone in as a paid position, basically, to look at a situation. So no, I do not mean it that way. What I'm meaning is that it's basically project planning. How are we going to attack this rescue? What are our recommendations? All of that is really part of the service of a CRO. We provide that free of charge, and there are times that we've provided consultative services, basically talking to them about it. People will state what their issues are. We'll make some recommendations that maybe will help correct that issue. And there's other times where we basically help them devise a plan that can help them either rescue the study or not. But I will say, in talking to potential clients, there have been times where we've said it's probably not in the best interest of the study to change CROs at that particular time. So that's what a consultative approach should be. It's really working with the sponsor to come up with not necessarily a detailed plan at that point, but enough information for them to help assess whether they should be engaging with a new CRO or staying with the one that they have.
Right, thank you. Let me scroll through here. We have a few more questions coming in. Is there a certain kind of study that is more vulnerable to being rescued over others, like the therapeutic area or a specific phase? Lynn, would you be able to shed some light on this one?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Again, thank you. That's a great question. I think rescues can definitely happen in any therapeutic area or indication or study phase. Looking back at the studies that we rescued, I think most of them needed rescue because that the previous CRO did not have the experience to execute the study. So I think the lack of experience is one of the most common reasons. But looking back at the warning signs and the root causes and non-performance, it's less about, I think, the area, but more about the specific team that is working with you. And again, do they have the know-how? Do they have the resources? And do they have the ability to execute this study and to meet your expectations? Hope that answers the question.
Thank you. All right, it's looking like we're getting a little low on time. We have just a few more minutes left, so I'll ask one more question, and then for anybody who submitted a question or who still has a question, please still go ahead and submit them through the control panel, and we'll do our best to follow up via email with you directly if we're not able to get to your question. So this one has come in a couple of different ways about risk-based monitoring, so I'd like to address that one. And Lynn and Terry, maybe you both could provide your input on it. The question is, how does a new monitoring team rescue a study with a risk-based monitoring strategy?
Yeah, that's again a good question. Thank you. Well, it really depends if what was monitored before needs to be remonitored. So it's easier if you can just take on where the other or the old team left and move on with your risk-based monitoring plan as is. But again, I guess it depends on if there are issues or not with the previously monitored data. Terry, do you have something to add?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's making me think of quite a few things. So it goes back to looking at our making up that plan, which is risk assessment. If the same EDC system is being used, and it's just a matter of another CRO data management group managing that EDC system, there really isn't much change. Just making sure there's proper training for the data managers so they can take over the study in that way. However, if you're moving to a new EDC system and there's a migration that's involved, one of the things I did not mention before, but I do need to mention now, which is when you're migrating that data to a new system, the signatures will break. So any approvals that have occurred on the previous system, source doc verification, PI approvals, anything of those natures, those are going to break. And the new system is not going to show that those activities occurred. So it may require more review by the monitors to get those noted in the if you're using your EDC system to note SDV. So it may require some remonitoring of documents. So again, it's one of those things going back to assessing whether that's going to impact the risk. Another thing to look at is, was the risk-based monitoring approach a contributing factor to maybe why the study was being looked at for rescue. If so, it may be an opportune time to take a look at that plan, the RBM plan, and see if maybe there's some changes that need to occur to that.
Very interesting. Thank you. Well, that's about all the time we have for today, everybody. I will leave the webinar portal open for a few more minutes. If you have additional questions, please go ahead and submit them. If we close out the webinar and you have questions thereafter, the email address here on the screen, sdcwebinar@sdcclinical.com. Please go ahead and email us, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can with any answers to your questions. And keep an eye on your inbox. You should be receiving the recording from today's webinar sometime this afternoon or by tomorrow afternoon at the latest. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.